Dead by Daylight. The hardest part when it comes to talking about its flaws is where to start. There are glaring technical issues ranging from a half-baked matchmaking system to deplorable frame rate drops given the frankly outdated looking textures and models. The game is filled with flawed design decisions such as an excessively grind-oriented progress system and some truly awful level design mistakes that even the most cursory quality assurance should have picked up on. Not to mention that patches have a 50% chance of breaking more than fixing, with the usual flurry of hotfixes coming through that can also break more than they fix. As generous as you can try to be, classical reviewing objectivity will most likely lead someone to calling this a terrible game. And it is a terrible game, in which I have over 200 hours of playtime, because it is also a great game. Complicated, I know. That's why this video will be more of a personal analysis than a normal critique, so with all that being said, let's start from the very beginning. In the simplest terms, Dead by Daylight is a game where 4 players try to survive by skulking in the shadows and doing objectives that eventually lead to an escape path, while a 5th player is the killer whose goal is to discover, chase and capture said survivors. Its mythos is steeped in B-movie horror classics, with its characters being close to lawsuit territory, and its gameplay tries to evoke both the more subtle and tense moments found in said classics. Though it is worth noting that the atmosphere is marked by the deliberate avoidance of the gorier elements this genre usually indulges in. Dead by Daylight may have you chainsawing people, but its heart is more at home in the Blair Witch Project rather than the high-octane thrills of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The systems here manage to capture both the thrill of stealth and evasion for survivals while working in tandem with the killer, both experiences having a ton of little kinks and tactics that will have players continually learning even tens of hours in. This all led to Dead by Daylight being one of the most successful, solely asymmetrical PC multiplayer games ever made, selling over 1 million copies, having its own meme culture and even being a Twitch TV hit. Keep in mind though, I use the word solely, as in there is no other aspect to the game rather than the asymmetrical multiplayer. None of the most popular multiplayer games today have the kind of symmetry you would find in a traditional system like chess. Counter-Strike is closer than most, but even there is plenty of variation in weapon choice from round to round. And yet, we do not call these games asymmetrical. Why? Because it's how the system, goals and game flow work together to achieve the effect of having 2 games overlaid on top of each other. That's why playing different roles in Defense of the Ancients or trying out different decks in Hearthstone doesn't qualify. You are still within the same system, playing around the same rules no matter the variants. But where exactly does this success come from? The Damned was a game that essentially had the same premise of 4 survivors versus 1 killer, and it fizzled out relatively quick, unlike Dead by Daylight, which is still going strong. Well, the reason for why this game works so well is the rather unique way in which direct survivor-killer interaction happens. The core of evasion, detection, chasing and catching has many steps in between, steps where each player can interact in many different viable ways that makes it seem like an adventure rather than a race to a finishing line. Think on your favorite multiplayer game and then think how long engagements of player skill actually last on a micro scale. The actual moment the guns are shot, teams meet, armies clash and cards are played. It's a matter of seconds if not fractions of a second. In Dead by Daylight, evasive moments and chases can last upwards to a minute plus, and that's what makes it so fundamentally engaging, despite some major frustration-inducing flaws in almost every aspect of the game. It provides a unique experience that requires a bit of explanation to truly appreciate. A round starts with the survivors meeting up in a lobby where they can discuss tactics for a minute or so, after which they get randomly thrown into one of the game's many maps, the goal being to activate generators that will power the way to freedom. While doing this, they are terrorized by a supernatural killer that is trying to find them, knock them down and proceed to carry them to hooks, which act as sacrificial altars to some eldritch horrors. If the killer succeeds in doing this, then there is a small time frame in which the survivor can be saved, but that requires coordination, teamwork and maybe even a sense of sacrifice. This whole scenario I just described can be roughly split into 2 main gameplay loops. There is the hide and seek aspect where the survivors try to power up the generators while avoiding the killer, who automatically sees said generators and patrols them vigorously. Quicktime events can trigger when working on generators, increasing their completion or setting it back, plus alerting the killer when failed. It's a cat and mouse game where the survivors try to balance how active and inactive they are at any given time in hopes of escaping as quick as possible without alerting the killer. Running usually not being advised since it leaves an orange trail that only the killer sees. And the glue that makes it all stick together is how differently the 2 asymmetrical sides perceive their environment. You probably already noticed, but the killer sees in first person, represented by a red cone of vision, while the survivors can look around in third person. This is complemented by the terror radius, an invisible aura emanating from the killer that gives a progressively loud audio cue to the survivor. First it's a heartbeat, then the sound gets progressively harsher and harsher the closer the distance. It's these two elements that make the moment-to-moment play so engaging when trying to evade the killer and escaping by the skin of your teeth, or finding a cowering survivor after minutes of fruitless searching. And when someone does get found, the second main gameplay loop starts, the actual chase. Survivors can only take 2 hits from the killer, who is faster by roughly 10% in terms of running speed. This makes the environment essential to how a chase plays out, because a survivor running in a straight line is easy prey. Pallets can be thrown down to slow the killer, and if the timing is right, land the stun, while windows can be vaulted faster by survivors than killers, which puts some valuable distance between the two. And that distance can be the difference between life and death, since outrunning the killer is not an option. At some point, preferably when line of sight is broken, the survivor must try to stealth away and evade the killer. The fun here is given by the gradient of gameplay I mentioned beforehand. There is always a split-second decision moment of where to run or where to chase. There is always something to ponder on after failure, something that could have been different in that particular chase, and it's engaging because these elements I mentioned are not affected by the macroscopic flow of the game. Sure, some pallets can be broken by a previous chase of another survivor, and killers such as the Trapper have a great deal of area control, but overall, the killer-survivor interactions are pretty self-contained, which makes failure all on the player, but success that much sweeter. That being said, its frustrating parts have some real rock-bottom moments. The game can feel like a 1v1v1v1v1 at times due to the lack of communication beyond some hand gestures, and combined with a broken matchmaking system, the teammates are sometimes more of a curse rather than a blessing. The ranking system doesn't help either. Both the killer and survivors can gain points by doing different actions, and if a certain rather easy threshold is passed, they rank up, or rather down, since 20 is the worst while 1 is the best, but I'd say the rank is quite meaningless in the end. And those points lead into another problem, since they're not just linked to the competitive aspect but also to how the progress system works. Each character has this blood web where points are spent to unlock items, while the game's malevolent entity eats up and reduces options, each filled out web signifying a level. Most of the options here are consumables that alter either the general map or the specific character, but it's quite obnoxious how much filler was shoved in. The Macmillan Ledger offering increases the chances of the round taking place on that specific map tile set, but since there is one such item for each map tile set and different rarities to boot, it quickly comes to pass that the inventory gets filled with tons of clutter. Because progress through this system revolves around trying to get the unique character perk that spawns each blood web and then trying to fill it up as fast as possible to progress to the next one. It sort of defeats the concept of progress when you want the game to screw you over and eat as much of the blood web as possible. There is also the issue that the unique character specific perks can become teachable to others, which removes all sense of uniqueness. It's less of a problem for killers since they all have a special ability, but survivors essentially become cosmetic choices once everything is unlocked. And unlocking everything is probably one of the biggest gripes with this game. It's a grind fest. It's so grindy that it puts Ubisoft sandboxes to shame. Thank God the core gameplay is so enjoyable, since I have this many hours in the game and I'm less than halfway to unlocking all there is to unlock. Not wanting to have players burn through content is understandable, but it would take weeks for a more casual player to put enough points into a character to have it decently perked out. The Bloodweb item prices should be decreased so many times over, it's not even funny. Don't get me wrong, the game is still enjoyable and winnable without the perks. Daily quests will force the player to use characters they haven't invested in, and it's not the end of the world, but I'd be lying if this snail's pace progress didn't prove to be a drag. Although that does show how fun the characters are at their core without any additions. The survivors are the same except looks, but the original killers are quite different. The Trapper can nab people with his traps, but even if they are seen, they can be used to close off escape routes. The Hillbilly can chainsaw run and patrol the map quickly while also being capable of downing in one hit, and the Wraith can cloak and uncloak to catch people by surprise. Although he is arguably the weakest, since good survivors will know how to keep track of him and properly run away. At any rate, all of them have enjoyable playstyles, but the more astute among you might have noticed I said the word original a few sentences ago. Why? Well, a new killer called the Nurse was released in the latest free DLC, and she has issues.
Surprise, motherfucker!
Not gonna lie, that felt great, it was an amazing snipe, but the survivor had exactly 0 things to do in that engagement. The nurse's ability to teleport, even at the cost of stunning herself, destroys the gradient gameplay that makes Dead by Daylight. Running isn't an option as much as hoping the nurse messes up her blink. It's not an issue of balance either, the developers released charts which show that she was the 3rd most lethal killer, most likely on account of how hard she is to use properly. It's just an engagement issue, plain and simple. Playing with and against the nurse ruins the way which makes the experience feel best. Look, there are a myriad more issues I can harp on. There are places called infinites in which survivors can get away forever, the killer has a basement on each map which makes rescues far too difficult, there is a problem with survivors destroying hooks, thus all killers have to run a counter perk, the newly included survive with friends mode makes it so much less enjoyable for the killer due to perfect coordination, and so on and so forth. But this isn't a critique per se, but more of a personal explanation of my experience and how much I enjoy the gameplay, which is a lot as you have probably noticed. What about the narrative though? What is the context of this experience? Well, it's quite simple really. A group of ethnically diverse young adults drop acid and decide to mess with the equipment on Old Man McGee's land. And this happens every night, it's quite infuriating. The poor McGee family is out there trying to stop these vandals. Even the wife has to go through the farm fields hoping to find and tie them up until the police arrives. It is a stark commentary on the ever-widening gap between generations due to the pace at which modern society changes. At least that's my interpretation of it. But hey, you can check the internet and make your own conclusions. Though come on, I have Latin in my name, how could I possibly be wrong? Honestly though, it's all in the atmosphere. While there are some sparse story elements online about how the killers came to be and their relation to the supernatural, it's hardly thrilling and not all that cohesive. For example, the Wraith was an unwitting murderer due to his boss and turns into a true murderer after getting revenge on said boss. None of this relates to his ability to become invisible. Though that doesn't make his design and the atmosphere he inspires any less enjoyable. It has many broken parts, but it just works and pretty much sums up my feelings for the game. The French-Canadian team Behavior Digital created something special that comes from what can be argued by some is a bad game. And that's why I wanted to talk about Dead by Daylight, to emphasize that the game and the experience derived from said game are not equivalent. Just look at how a normal player goes through a game and then how a speedrunner does. Glitches and bugs no longer become frustrating moments, but golden opportunities to find the new, fastest route. And it's that concept that stuck with me through the worst moments to get to this title's best ones. Dead by Daylight isn't the best game in the world, but it has been one of the best experiences I've had in gaming. Maybe it was the novelty too, which means I probably won't be enjoying anything that it inspires moving forward. Perhaps I will already be jaded to the experience, but even that won't take away the countless hours spent engaged and focused, trying to find those subtle survivors or escaping from the unrelenting killer.